This picture is an artist's depiction of a time in 1859 when on the Indonesian island of Bacan, Alfred Russel Wallace caught sight of his very first golden birdwing butterfly. Wallace captured this moment and described it like this. He said, "The beauty and brilliancy of this insect are indescribable. None but a naturalist can understand the intense excitement I experienced when at length I captured it. On taking it out of the net and opening the glorious wings, my heart beat furiously. The blood rushed to my head, and I felt much more like fainting than I ever have done in apprehension of immediate death. I had a headache the rest of the day, so great was the excitement produced by what would appear to most people as a rather inadequate cause." So to also commemorate this moment, on November 7th in 2013, the 100-year anniversary of Wallace's death, a bronze statue of the naturalist was unveiled in London's Natural History Museum by, as you can see down below, Sir David Attenborough, Bill Bailey, patron of the Wallace Fund and star of the BBC miniseries Bill Bailey's Jungle Hero, all about Wallace. And the third gentleman is Richard Wallace, treasurer of the Wallace Fund and Alfred's grandson. So this statue captures the moment when Wallace first laid eyes on a golden birdwing butterfly. This is also now known as Wallace's golden birdwing. And what he's looking at is one of the buildings of the London Museum of Natural History, and on that building is a bronze replica of the birdwing butterfly that he's gazing at. So we're in the middle of Festival here at the museum, where we celebrate evolution, and our attention is often drawn to Charles Darwin, who rightfully so is associated with the explanation of evolution. Here's a picture of me with a bronze statue of a young Charles Darwin at Christ Church, Cambridge, back in 2009 when we were celebrating his 200 years since his birth and 150 years since the publication of The Origin of Species. By the way, the statue was made by the same artist that made the Wallace statue as well. And so very often I come to Festival to talk about Charles Darwin, sometimes even dressed up as Charles Darwin, but not today. Today we are going to turn our attention to another great evolutionary biologist. Charles Darwin rightfully is linked with the idea of evolution because he was the first one not to say that evolution happened, but to find a mechanism that explained how it happened. And so we look back upon when Darwin first thought of his evolutionary tree and how it might have come about. But he wasn't the only one. Alfred Russel Wallace we should recognize as the co-discoverer of evolution by natural selection. So Alfred Russel Wallace was born in 1823. He died at age 90, almost 100 years ago, 1913. And here he is described by Dr. George Beccaloni, who's an entomologist and evolutionary biologist and the founder of the Alfred Russel Wallace Correspondence Project. Wallace was not only the co-discoverer of evolution by natural selection with Charles Darwin in 1858, but he also made very many other significant contributions, not just to biology, but also to subjects as diverse as glaciology, land reform, anthropology, ethnography, epidemiology, and astrobiology. His pioneering work on evolutionary biogeography, the study of how plants and animals are distributed, led to him becoming recognized as that subject's father. Beyond this, Wallace is regarded as the preeminent collector and field biologist of tropical regions of the 19th century. By Wallace's death, he was not only the most famous living scientist at that time, but some would argue that he was actually the best known name in the world at that time. So Alfred Russel Wallace was born in what is Wales in 1823, southeastern Wales. Thomas Vere Wallace and Mary Ann Greenell. He was the 8th of 9 children, and there's actually some argument over who can lay claim to this famous scientist. Obviously, people from Wales say he was born in Wales, he must be Welsh. But since he came from English parents, growing up he was always called that English boy, and then not long after moved back to England and always wrote of himself as English, most people would consider Alfred Russel Wallace as an English scientist rather than a Welsh scientist. He left school at age 14 and spent several years working as a land surveyor and developing a great passion for natural history, especially collecting insects and beetles. Now, it's no coincidence that he and Darwin both collected beetles. It was a craze during Victorian England, and they're so diverse and so beautiful and so interesting to capture that a lot of people were starting these kinds of collections if they were interested in natural history. It was around this time when he was about 20 years old, he met the then 19-year-old Henry Bates, who he later journeyed with Wallace to the Amazon. And Bates also gave the first scientific description of mimicry in animals, one animal looking like another one. So for example, a harmless insect looking like a dangerous insect so that predators would avoid it simply based upon its coloration. And so we now have the term Batesian mimicry. In 1848, at the age of 25, both Wallace and Bates were inspired to travel and collect and study natural history. They're inspired by writings by people like the Prussian Alexander von Humboldt, who some people have described as Shakespeare is to the English language as von Humboldt is to natural history and travel writing. He's also, by the way, one of the people that inspired Darwin to first go on his famous voyage. But Wallace was also inspired by Darwin's writing, The Voyage of the Beagle. This coming some years after Darwin had returned. So Bates and Wallace decided to travel to the Amazon. Wallace spent almost 4 years traveling around Brazil and the Amazon jungle, primarily in the middle of the Amazon jungle. And in fact, he managed to ascend the Rio Negro river system further than any European scientist had ever been. Bates ended up staying in Brazil for about 11 years, collecting even more, also collecting insects. Wallace was not a wealthy gentleman like Charles Darwin, and so he and Bates traveled to the Amazon in order to not only study the natural history, but also make their fortune, collecting insects and animals from all around the world, especially the tropics, was a big craze at that time. And so they could sell these collections for large amounts of money. So Wallace and Bates would both travel, they would split up, they would go around, spend months and months, years in fact, collecting. And Wallace would send his collections back sort of every couple of months, all carefully packed for a long voyage back to England. He'd send them back to the port in Brazil where he first landed to have them shipped off to England. Well, after his 4 years of traveling, he returned to this port, and it turns out through a miscommunication, none of his samples, or hardly any of his samples, had actually been shipped back to England. All of them were there waiting for him in Brazil. So he booked a passage on a ship, took all of his collections. He also had a lot of live collections at the time. So he had monkeys and birds that were alive, and then a lot of dead collected organisms, insects and bird feathers and skins. And so all of his collections, all of his notes, all of his sketches from 4 years of traveling, which was going to make him a fortune, were on this boat. After about 26 days at sea, Wallace recorded what I think has to be probably one of the most British things I have ever seen written down. On that morning, after breakfast, I was reading in the cabin when the captain came down and said to me, "I'm afraid the ship's on fire. Come and see what you think of it." That kind of reaction. I'd be running around screaming, the ship's on fire. Come and see what you think of it. So unfortunately, the ship's cargo had caught fire. Eventually, the entire ship went up in flames, and the crew was forced to abandon ship. All of the specimens that Wallace had on the ship, including many of the live animals, mostly collected during the last and most interesting years of his trip, were completely lost. He could only save parts of his diary and just a few sketches, and one parrot. He wrote, he was sitting on a rope hanging from the prow of the ship, and this, burning above him, let him fall into the water, where after floating a little way, we picked him up. So I can only have this mental image of all these amazing collections that Wallace did. Here he is sitting on a little rowboat with a soggy parrot in his hand. And that's the only thing he has to show for these 4 years of adventuring. But Wallace was not one to look down on his situation. British stiff upper lip. This is what he wrote about another part of the voyage back. He said, "The next day, the 8th, was fine. Gulfweed was still floated plentifully by us, and there were numerous flying fish, some of which fell into our boats, and others which flew an immense distance over the waves. I now found my hands and face very much blistered by the sun, and exceedingly sore and painful. At night, boobies, large dusky seabirds with very long wings, flew about us. During the night, I saw several meteors, and in fact, could not be in a better position for observing them than lying on my back in a small boat in the middle of the Atlantic." So even after this tragedy, he's thinking, oh, what a nice place to watch shooting stars, lying on this little tiny boat. So for 10 days, Wallace and his comrades from the ship struggled to survive in a pair of badly leaking lifeboats. Finally, they were sighted and picked up by a passing cargo ship, which was also very old, not very well supplied, and leaking. So eventually, they made their way back to England over the course of an 80-day journey. So I'd like to share a little bit about the biography from Alfred Russel Wallace from a fantastic web page. The web page is called the Alfred Russel Wallace page, and is kept up and written by Dr. Charles H. Smith, who is a science librarian and scholar at Western Kentucky University. I think has to be the preeminent scholar of Wallace in North America. So Dr. Smith said that Wallace was able to secure a grant from the Royal Geographic Society to cover his passage, then referred to in the days as the Malay Archipelago. So after collecting for 4 years and having everything destroyed, being completely penniless, instead of just calling it quits, Wallace goes out, looks for more money to go on another trip even further, the islands between Southeast Asia and Australia, the Malay Archipelago. So he arrived in Singapore on the 20th of April, 1854, to begin what would turn to be the defining period of his life. He spent 8 full years there and undertook 70 different expeditions. Over these 8 years, his collecting efforts produced the astonishing total of 125,660 specimens, including more than 1,000 species new to science. The volume he later wrote describing his work and experiences there was called The Malay Archipelago. It's the most celebrated of all the writings on Indonesia, and ranks with a small handful of other works as one of the 19th century's best scientific travel books. Highlights of his adventure there, including his study and capture of birds of paradise and primates, his many dealings with the native peoples, headhunters, his residence on New Guinea. He was one of the very first Europeans to live on New Guinea for any extended period of time. And I want to share with you part of a letter that he wrote from Borneo to his mother. "I must now tell you of the addition to my household of an orphan baby, which I have nursed now for more than a month. I feed it 4 times a day, and I wash it and brush its hair every day, which it likes very much, only crying when it's hungry or dirty. I'm afraid you would call it an ugly baby, for it has a dark brown skin and red hair, a very large mouth, but very pretty little hands and feet, has powerful lungs, and sometimes screams tremendously, so I hope it will live. He was, of course, writing about an orphaned orangutan that he collected in the forest, not an actual baby. I won't tell you how that baby orangutan was orphaned. You really don't want to know. Let's just say Wallace was a collector. So Wallace is especially known for his zoogeography, including his discovery and description of the faunal discontinuity that now bears his name, that is called the Wallace Line. So obviously this is an imaginary line, a biogeographic line across the globe in the Malay archipelago. It extends between the islands of Bali and Lombok to the south, and Borneo and Sulawesi further north. And it marks the limits of eastern extent of many Asian animal forms, and conversely, the limits of the western extent of many of the Australia and Australian forms. So in a letter to his friend, Henry Walter Bates, in 1858, Wallace wrote this: "In the archipelago, there are two distinct faunas, rigidly circumscribed, which differ as much as those of South America and Africa, and more than that of Europe and North America. Yet there's nothing on the map or on the face of the islands to mark their limits. The boundary line often passes between islands closer than the others in this same group. I believe the western part to be a separated portion of continental Asia, and the eastern the fragmentary prolongation of a former Pacific continent. In mammalia and birds, the distinction is marked by genera, families, even orders, confined to one region. In insects, by a number of genera and little groups of peculiar species, the families of insects having generally a universal distribution." So what Wallace was describing was a completely different set of animals to one side of this line than to the other side of this line. So why is this the case? So some might think that it has something to do with geography and history, one of the suggestions that Wallace was making, that there used to be a connection between these islands, and then also a connection, physical connection between these islands. There is, in fact, a deep channel of water that runs between them, but of course that wouldn't stop many things that could fly or swim. And so what Wallace came to realize is that it's as much the interactions between living organisms that determine the community or the ecosystem as it is the non-living, the geographical features as well. And it's a combination of the two that decides where you find certain species and certain organisms. And so this is why Wallace is known as one of the first father figures of the entire field of distribution of organisms, biogeography. It was in February of 1858, about halfway through his 8-year trip, while suffering from an attack of malaria, that Wallace suddenly connected two ideas. The ideas of the English economist Thomas Malthus on the limits to population growth in humans, to a mechanism that could ensure long-term organic change in organisms. So this was the very concept which later was dubbed survival of the fittest or natural selection. He put these ideas together while lying on this bench, lying on a cot, suffering from malaria, sweating, sick, feeling horrible, had nothing to do except lie around and think and think and think. These ideas suddenly came together in his mind, but ideas that had been growing for a long time. He actually went to the Malay archipelago looking for information about evolution. The idea of evolution was in the air. People had been talking about it, scientists like Lamarck. There had been a book called The Vestiges, which had been published about evolution, but nobody had been able to explain a mechanism. And the idea behind the mechanism occurred to Wallace. He was very excited about this. So he wrote a paper about it, and he sent this paper to his correspondent, Charles Darwin. I had said before that Darwin had been an inspiration for him. He had met Darwin previous to leaving for Asia, and he had kept up a correspondence with Darwin as well as a sort of scientific hero of his. So this paper was titled "On the Tendency of Varieties to Depart Indefinitely from the Original Type." They described how new kinds of species, new kinds of organisms, could change from an original kind of organism, the mechanism for evolution. This was the exact same idea that Darwin had been thinking about, writing about to himself for 20 years, but had not yet published. Now, a lot of people think that Darwin was scared of publishing. It was a big idea. It was a very controversial idea at the time. But another interpretation of this 20-year period was Darwin simply was doing good science. He was collecting as much information to back up his idea as he could before he would present it to science. Nowadays, there's this rush to publish new ideas so you don't get out-scooped and you want to get your research out there as quick as possible. Back then, when everything was written and mailed around and evidence had to be collected over the course of months and years, especially when you're going to the tropics to collect your information, it was a slower pace. And so Darwin was writing, he was thinking about science, and my interpretation, as many scholars is that Darwin was simply researching. He was simply collecting information before he'd published. But here was this idea from Wallace, the exact same idea. In fact, some of the words and the terms described were exactly the same, how natural selection works. And so Darwin wasn't sure what to do. So he turned to his mentors, one of whom was the esteemed geologist Lyell, and his friend, the botanist Hooker, and said, what should I do? Here's the same idea that I've been working on. And they came up with a compromise of publishing, presenting both of their ideas together to the Linnaean Society. Now, they couldn't ask Wallace. Wallace was halfway around the world. So they weren't going to publish this. They were just going to present it at a meeting. And so Darwin wrote up a sketch of his ideas along with Wallace's paper, which described the same ideas, and both were presented at this meeting, and nobody cared. Nobody found any interest in this whatsoever at the time. In fact, the president of the Linnaean Society said, "It's unfortunate this year we have not had any major advances." And what they had done was describe how all of biodiversity on the planet had come about. So it wasn't until next year, in 1859, when Darwin finished his writing and publication of The Origin of Species, did the idea really make a splash. So the reason we associate Darwin's name so much with natural selection was because he was the one that convinced everyone, presented the evidence, the 20 years of work and thought and writing this book. But Wallace came up with the exact same idea. And that's why we call them co-discoverers of this idea. Wallace wasn't only interested in biology. He had a broad mind that went in lots of different directions, very interested in many areas of science and social reform. He was also very interested in presenting evidence to understand the world. And so he would debunk, through skepticism, questioning the evidence of certain ridiculous claims or extreme claims, a lot of different ideas. And so one of those was debunking this flat earth idea, which you can still find people that are interested in this idea today, but of course it was an even bigger thing back in the 1800s. So in 1870, a flat earth proponent named John Hampden offered a 500-pound wager, which in today's terms would be about $68,000 Canadian, not a small amount of money, in a magazine advertisement to anyone who could demonstrate the curvature of the earth over a body of water like a river or a canal or a lake. So Wallace was intrigued by this challenge. He was also very short on money. He'd come back and sold a lot of his collection. He had a lot of money through a series of bad investments. He had very little of it left. So he wanted to make some money, and he was also kind of interested in presenting the evidence we had for a round Earth. So he came up with what was a really cool experiment called the Bedford Level experiment, shown below. What he did was, along a 10-kilometer stretch of canal, he mounted two objects exactly the same height above water, 10 kilometers apart. He also mounted a telescope on a bridge the exact same height above the water. When seen through the telescope, one object appeared slightly higher than the other, showing the curvature of the Earth, even over those 10 kilometers. So the judge for the wager declared Wallace the winner. He had demonstrated what was asked of him. But Hampden, who made the bet, refused to accept the result. He actually sued Wallace and started a multi-year campaign writing letters calling Wallace a fraud and a liar. So of course he was wrong. Wallace won multiple libel suits against him, but the resulting court costs actually cost Wallace more money than he won in the wager. And this controversy really frustrated him for many years. He'd used evidence, he'd used science to show that the world was round, and he ended up losing money on the deal. Wallace also confronted the claims that there were canals made by intelligent alien life on Mars. There were lines on Mars, we could see that, but the argument was whether they were made by Martians or whether they were naturally occurring features. So he was actually one of the very first scientists to evaluate the likelihood of life on other planets. He felt it wasn't possible in our solar system that there was other life besides on our planet, and he thought it unlikely in the galaxy as a whole. He criticized the claims of Percival Lowell that the Martian canals were built by intelligent beings, and Wallace did months of research, consulted many experts, and produced his own scientific analysis of the climate and the atmosphere of Mars to demonstrate that there could not be intelligent life building these canals. We think he was probably right about that. Wallace was also, very interestingly, anti-vaccination. Now, this is a subject that comes up today, whether people should be vaccinated or not, and people have various reasons why they believe one way or the other. And so in terms of skepticism in science, most would say that we're pro-vaccination. We think that's actually a good idea. There's good scientific evidence behind it. But that wasn't necessarily the case back in the 1800s. It's not that vaccines didn't protect you from diseases. They did. It's that the way they were given was very unsanitary, and since it was mandatory across all of England, Wallace was claiming through an epidemiological statistical study that actually more people were harmed by the vaccinations than were helped by their anti-disease properties at the time. So he said at that present time, in the 1870s in England, that the vaccinations were the cause of more deaths than smallpox. Not throughout the entire length of the time. Obviously, smallpox deaths had been greatly reduced by vaccinations, but the way that the vaccinations were produced, their very unsanitary administration techniques, and a general improvement in sanitation and hygiene meant that they were actually doing possibly more harm than good at the time. Wallace, this wasn't the only controversial issue Wallace was involved with at the time. He was also very interested in the idea of phrenology, which is a study of the shape of your head and face and bumps on your head and what that tells you about your personality or what that tells you about your mental abilities. This was very popular at the time. Wallace said that phrenologists had shown certain peculiarities in the organization of the brain had a relation to the functions of the mind. So what I like about this idea is he was putting together two scientific ideas which belong together, that the mind is a function of the brain. But measuring the size and shape of your skull wasn't maybe necessarily the best way of going about that at the time. An even more controversial idea that is often associated with Wallace is his belief in spiritualism, the idea that there are ghosts that can speak to people, that a spirit can manifest itself in our world, sometimes through somebody or in darkened rooms, rapping on tables and ringing bells. So spiritualism was a huge craze in Victorian England at the time. People would hold seances, mediums would speak to the dead and would create ectoplasmic goo out of thin air. They would make objects move. Well, what we now likely believe is that some of these people, or all of these people, were charlatans out to fleece people of their money, and they were using sort of simple magic tricks to make these things happen in darkened rooms, people's own imaginations to fill in the blanks. But Wallace was quite taken with spiritualism. He gave a talk, the title's right there, If a Man Die, Shall He Live Again? It's a lecture he delivered in San Francisco, June 5th, 1887. It turns out that during his life, this was one of the most well-read and largest money-making writings and speakings that he ever did. He was known for his science and had a big impact on science, but in the general public, he made the most money out of selling copies of his lecture about spiritualism. So once again, Wallace thought he was following the evidence. He was a man of science. This wasn't just made up, but he said that the theory that is most scientific is the one that best explains the whole series of phenomena, and he therefore claimed that the spirit hypothesis was the most scientific hypothesis. But a lot of his fellow scientists, even at the time, Darwin, Lyell, kind of shook their heads. They disagreed that that wasn't the way to explain people rapping on tables in darkened rooms. But Wallace went beyond just the idea of seances and mediums, and he applied this kind of thinking to the general idea of where we come from, why are humans conscious, why can animals think, the greater ideas of evolution. So Wallace believed that the unseen spirit world had interceded at least 3 times in the history of our planet. Once in the creation of life from inorganic matter, once in the introduction of consciousness in the higher animals, and then finally in the generation of the higher mental faculties in mankind. So he believed the sole purpose of the universe was the development of the human spirit. Now, that's not to say that he turned his back on natural selection or evolution. All of the rest of biodiversity and all of the rest of evolution could be described by natural processes. But Wallace felt that there were certain things that natural selection just couldn't explain adequately for him. And this is where he and Darwin differed greatly. Darwin felt that all of these things could be explained by natural processes, as Wallace, in these 3 special exceptions, took a supernatural or a non-physical approach to how he believed the science behind this worked. So in his 50s, his scientific interests broadened. He not only studied biology, but began to write on things like glaciology and the skeptical issues we talked about, astrobiology, vaccination. Most of his work was still on natural selection and geographic distributions, and his greatest books and works are on those subjects. But he worked on many other scientific subjects as well. In his 60s, he became also very active in writing on social issues, such as labor rights, women's rights, economic and land reform. So in Victorian England, he would have been seen as a radical, not sort of part of the very established conservative group of political thinkers. In fact, Wallace's writings on land nationalization featured many ideas that were way in advance of his time. So for example, he suggested the legislated protection of rural lands and historical monuments, the construction of green belts and parks, and the argument for suburban and rural repopulation and organization. So he was an ecological thinker, both in the sense of describing the ecological world around him, but also in terms of making it a more natural and green, safer place in England as well. His main adventure of his post-Malay archipelago life was a 10-month lecture tour to the United States and Canada in 1886 and 1887. He visited lots of different cities in the US and in Canada. He visited Kingston and Toronto. While he was in the US, he met President Cleveland, and he toured the redwood forests with famed naturalist John Muir. Upon returning to England, he published the book Darwinism in 1889, which was the subject of most of his lecture series. When he wasn't talking about spiritualism, he was talking about natural selection. But Wallace should not be seen as an afterthought. He wasn't somebody that was describing Darwin's views, and he wasn't simply the person that kickstarted Darwin's interest to write The Origin of Species. He had his own ideas about evolution and disagreed with Darwin on some main points, some minor points, but on the main points, they were in agreement about how natural selection worked. But Wallace continued to write about biology, continued to write about natural selection, ecology, biodistribution, and contributed huge amounts of new information, original thought, and really influential thinking in the areas of science. And so he was really seen as one of two important people helping, supporting, and discussing and advancing Darwin's ideas of evolution, along with Thomas Henry Huxley, who's often known as Darwin's bulldog. So despite Wallace's radical associations and links with spiritualism, he is now best known, and should be best known, as the father of biogeography and the co-discoverer of natural selection. So thanks so much for listening. I'd be happy to answer any questions.